All right, welcome back everyone. So next up we have Damien Huffer, who's going to be talking through using machine learning, computer vision, and text mining to detect and understand the online trafficking of human remains. Damien was most recently a postdoctoral fellow within the Osteoarchaeological Research Laboratory, Department of Archaeology and Classical Studies at Stockholm University. During 2014-16, he held the Stable Isotope Postdoctoral Fellowship at the Smithsonian Museum Conservation Institute of Anthropology. That's a lot of long words. He is currently an honorary research associate with UQ School of Social Science and has recently collaborated with the UQ School of Justice. Can we give a very warm round of applause for Mr. Damien Huffer?
Thank you so much, Lucas. I really appreciate it. And okay, great, slides are up. Okay, and thank you everyone, of course, for inviting me today. So I think it's important, given the nature of what I'm talking about, and we're talking about the trafficking of ancestral remains around the world, that I, of course, start with a welcome to country. So I'll have to turn and face it, sorry. Let's see. I'll stand up here and look that way, right. We acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and the Kombumerri families of the Yugambeh language family of the Gold Coast. We acknowledge their continuing connections to land, waters, and community. We pay our respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures and to elders past, present, and emerging. Okay, thank you. Okay, that should, yep, all right. Thanks for that warm introduction, and I'm excited to present to you all today, my first time at this conference. I hope that what I will speak about can stand as an interesting and important example of how experts in cybersecurity, ethical AI, and social media research can, nay must, work together to continue to tackle the flourishing of illicit markets across platforms. So a quick note to begin with. May I ask, you can take any photographs that you'd like here, but can I ask you kindly to not post any photographs onto your own accounts? As I watch the traffickers, I know that many of them are watching me as well. And also, I want to note to all in attendance that there are 3, fortunately, not gory and not too graphic examples of human remains as trafficked items in sales posts that I included for illustrative purposes here. So I want to give you a fair warning of that. I'm sorry I'm right before lunch, but now I've let you know, so I want to carry on. Okay. I always like to begin with a case study to set the stage, to demonstrate clearly that human remains trafficking remains a real and arguably growing problem today on and offline. So here we have a case that received considerable media coverage in 2019. A man in Egypt was apprehended after a shipment was seized at Cairo airport. Bound for Belgium, the fragments of mummy it left were one of several possible shipments allegedly ordered by a buyer found on Facebook. Fortunately, this was stopped in time by security authorities at Cairo airport. But I can tell you that mummy remains are real, quote-unquote, prestige items in these trafficking communities, regardless of whether they have been circulating between collections for decades or were more recently exported. Thus, I want to stress, cases like this are just the tip of the iceberg, but extreme examples always make the news. There is much more under the scenes, if you will. So, at the start, you might be asking yourself this question. That's correct? Yeah. Why should the living care who buys the dead? To me, it always comes down to the fact that the dead can't speak for themselves, and the private commercial market today, on and offline, continues a long tradition of commodification or fetishization of individuals' ancestral remains from around the world, usually global south to global north, a practice that's been occurring from colonial times and has exploded today. So we, as forensic anthropologists, archaeologists, criminologists, and cybercrime researchers, civilian and law enforcement alike, can and must help. The reasons given at left are, to me, a few of the many that would justify why we do the work we do. And it might not surprise you, the rise of e-commerce and social media has allowed a quirky hobby to explode and proliferate, an issue known about as far back as early eBay, the days of the height of eBay's market in the early 2000s. If anything, the problem of selling the unconvenience dead has gotten worse, even as it slowly gets more attention. There are many gray areas, and there is much left to find and know. Okay. So, I trust that I don't need to tell anyone in this room that the internet is a vast ecosystem, constantly fluctuating as laws and policy changes, and with many unexplored corners, not just on the dark web, but the deep and surface web too. Hence, what my colleagues and I frequently say, why my colleagues and I frequently say that illicit trafficking is often hiding in plain sight. Thus, to chart uncharted spaces where a variety of crimes flourish, take partnerships, and combine skill sets. If our end goal is preventing cybercrime and separating illicit from illicit commerce in general. Where trafficking is concerned, the goal is to create better and more enforceable data-driven policy and guiding material for law enforcement so we can improve the extent to which we can encounter and expose it ethically until such time as the platforms themselves are legally required to really act. So, to this end, I want to circle back a bit to situate my and colleagues' work that aims to understand today's human remains trade using digital humanities tools within its larger context. So, together with my Carleton University colleague, Professor Sean Graham, we have led the Bone Trade Project since 2018. And we are also 2 of 7 co-founders of the Alliance to Counter Crime Online. So this NGO was founded in 2018 also, and we are dedicated to researching a wide variety of categories of trafficking to understand similarities and differences between how platforms are used to move, for example, drugs, wildlife, antiquities, human remains, living humans, animal cruelty videos, spread drug cartel messaging, the list goes on and on. Really, part of this work has been creating infographics, like the one I have here, fact sheets, briefing reports, and policy documents to help legislatures in various governments quickly grasp the issues. Here, how illicit goods are fenced on many e-commerce platforms. But as you all would understand, of course, the devil is in the details when it comes to the cyber side of all this. So, what does the current landscape of human remains trafficking online look like? The short answer is it's complicated. The long answer can be seen here to some extent. Mind you, this data from a 2020 paper concerns only public Instagram profiles, personal and business pages. It is itself an update of our initial efforts to scrape public Instagram pages using several key hashtags, such as hashtag #HumanSkullForSale. While total prices increase year by year, note that these are underestimates, given we found more relevant public accounts with fewer unique public posts that stated prices publicly and openly. So we know that this is a cross-platform issue. The key point here is that the algorithms behind them actively influence how and which pages researchers, buyers, or onlookers encounter, whether on purpose or accidentally. Okay, so before I go further, a note about where we stand on user privacy and the ethics of scraping the public internet and taking a macro-level big data approach, which is the way we've performed this work so far. So, like the agents and their dog targets in the cartoon at right, which I always have found funny, we are concerned with providing contextual intel to law enforcement when asked, and assessing the large-scale patterns inherent in the image, text, and metadata we collect, separating the signal from the noise. Well, in the paper I mentioned in the slide, we provide a much more detailed discussion of how we frame our ethical responsibilities, but the key point here is that we now restrict what we publish or share within any publications, even as supplementary material, because we guard against the realization that full de-anonymization is not really possible. And we've come to learn that, and now we act on that knowledge. So we securely store most of what we scrape, and then you can analyze just those aspects of the data that interest you. Okay. At this point in my talk, you might be asking yourself, why is controlling the proliferation of this and many other forms of trafficking online so difficult? Again, this is complicated and certainly frustrating to civilians and law enforcement alike, but hinges on the fact that most global platforms are US-based, taking advantage of specific laws and a sometimes complacent media. For example, the still from a TikTok video of a particular individual that formed the catalyst for a separate study this year that I discussed later. As important, the private commercial collection of especially skeletal material sits within gaps in current Commonwealth laws of many countries. It's not really people and not really property. Dealers actively exploit these loopholes, knowing that enforcement is rare and law enforcement often only interested in big money antiquities busts. This is changing in part due to our and the Alliance's work. It's a slowly but surely kind of process. Very slowly, but we're working on it. So, in addition to the legal issues, let's circle back to the fact that the same algorithms that we all know can monitor, record, and act on our browsing history for whatever purpose can also be readily tricked by those determined to commit illicit commerce. The sales advert left from Etsy is a good example. Etsy publicly claimed to ban the human remains trade in 2012, before eBay followed suit in 2016. However, we see here someone advertising a ring by indicating human remains are available. Just send a DM. Little risk for possibly greater reward. I thus note what are to me two key cybersecurity implications of this. Quote-unquote bans mean nothing without IP blocking, and the ease with which proliferation of trafficked goods occurs also carries personal cybersecurity risks for those who accidentally find shocking content. So how do we better understand what's happening? Okay. In the remainder of my talk, I will discuss the how of three of the approaches our work has taken to date, in terms of image and text analysis to view the online trade at scale, and give a few summary examples of what we have done so far. Firstly, this slide is provided just to make sure we are on the same page regarding the definition of key terms, or at least how I define them as an itinerant digital humanities scholar. I come from it maybe from a different perspective than you, but I wanted to show you how I think of it. If I'm incorrect, I apologize, but this is how we've approached it. So we have here a rough and ready schematic of how a convolutional neural network attempts to classify an unknown image into a category of known images via sampling and convolutions. For our purposes, the last and second to last layers are key. The fact that 37% of the output of the last layer calls the cat-shaped image a dog is just a bit of a joke to illustrate that it's not perfect yet, but we are trying to push boundaries. So illicit trafficking research using machine learning is still a very new frontier. Okay. So the following three slides present a bit of a summary of three of the techniques and software scraping packages we have used to date. I present this information with the caveat that, as we all know, apace, algorithms, and internal machinations can change rapidly, especially when research shines light on online crime. So consider it as food for thought. More details on the steps between these general steps will be forthcoming in the appendices of a book that Professor Graham and I currently have under review about the bone trade. So on this first slide, we describe how to obtain hashtag metadata from public Instagram using Instagram CLI in Python, authored by Suwash Jawale of MIT. The important points to note are, one, of course, if you want to do this, use a sock puppet account only. In your code, keep changing where it asks for tag of interest to whichever hashtag you want to scrape. Keep the number in your code after this underscore many low, maybe 10 or so, and leave gaps between incidents of scraping to avoid account blocking. And where your code asks save to device, a false after the equal sign excludes images and media, like video, and a true will include it. And the username and password requested by the code are those of your purpose-made account, and running your code will give you an alert from Instagram labeled as a new login attempt from Chrome Mobile on Google Pixel 2. That's just how it recognizes the use of this. Everything saves as a JSON file that can be converted to CSV and tabulated in Excel for further analysis and storing of what you want to store. Okay. In the scraping task above, one creates an environment called scrape. Open your terminal or command prompt in the folder you were working on, the one that contains your tagscrape.py program, though we won't be using that program this time, and activate your environment. As you may obviously know, Jupyter notebooks can be used with numerous languages, but here we stick with Python. Install your packages from within your Jupyter notebook for ease of access. Instagram CLI gets us our metadata, while GenSim allows text analysis, and PyLDA-Viz will allow visualization of the results for better interpretation. As above, change the hashtag to whichever one you want to explore and set this underscore many to a low number. Set hashtag underscore type equal to recent. Using GenSim, pre-processing of your text corpus will remove prepositions such as then, and of. And then we've taken two directions. Word vector modeling envisions words as in a text corpus as occupying a two-dimensional space, where words used more frequently together in source text are closer together. We've used word2vec to create models using the text pre-processed in GenSim, and we found that use of the continuous bag of words feature is the best approach. It'll give you similarity measures between 0 and 1, will define each pair of words, and GenSim's word analogies option allows further exploration. Topic modeling of word corpus data uses corpora, also in GenSim, again with the bag of words option. You set the number of topics that you want to guess the corpora contains, and then use PyLDA-Viz to visualize how word usage sorts between the topics. Okay, and then finally, I'll talk a bit about what we've done with Pixplot. So, the Yale Digital Humanities Lab has written and bundled together the code necessary to run thousands of images through a neural network trained for image recognition using Google Inception version 3. But instead of labeling each image, the code looks at how each image causes the neural network to light up in different ways, as a list of numbers or scores along each dimension that the neural network looks at. The mathematical distance between each list can be measured, and the result can be visualized using various clustering algorithms. Here, we have used Python 3.7 and Pixplot, installed via pip install. After creating a path to the folders of JPEG images on your computer, Pixplot will create subfolders and a website within that location folder to display one's results. Pixplot allows you to also attach metadata to each image after clustering, which the Pixplot repository can explain further. Once everything is sorted into clusters, you can then examine each hotspot at the center of each cluster of images and move between them to explore how and why your corpus has been sorted thusly. Then the human-mediated interpretation of the output is where insight into image composition and trafficking patterns can come from. Okay, so the first example of our various uses of these techniques to date comes from our initial publication of 2017. our first look at networks and community structure between bone trading accounts on public Instagram. Here, we use scrape Instagram followers from web robots to then explore the network between the 22 accounts that we found, then named a price on their sales advertisements, and obtained a list of followers in common circa late 2016 between those accounts. This resulted in approximately 138,000 users with 172,000 shared links that connected these 22 high-profile individuals. So, using a multimodal transformation plugin, Gephi, we ordered the accounts by page rank, or in other words, how likely a random user was to encounter them when just beginning to search for human remains-related hashtags, like hashtag human skull for sale, for example. We used arc diagram in R to visualize this, and from this, 3 sub-communities emerged, revealing a relatively strict hierarchy between specialists, high-money, high-profile people collecting very certain types of remains, generalists who just want to get ahead at all costs, pardon the pun, and the enthusiasts who are new to the trade and through their following connection to the high-profile people get encouraged to collect more, buy more, and overlook legal, moral, and ethical issues inherent in the practice. So this was also before the online community had any real awareness that exposure was coming also. So these networks have certainly changed by now. Okay. In that same paper, we also explored how the bone trade community uses what we call hashtag stuffing, or distinct patterns of hashtag and word reuse across posts and perhaps across platforms. We asked, might this be a way to identify individual users' digital fingerprints within these spaces without needing to identify the person's name or handle? Here, in this first attempt to do this, we use the text reuse package in R, and that generates engrams of 5-word sets, and then assesses exact match similarity using Jacquard coefficients. That's in the order and the spelling and where the hashtag is, how close is the exact match of the set. As the example shows, there's promise here. And you can see how between the first 2 examples, it's almost a perfect match of 1 because it just has the addition of hashtag dead at the end. And the next 2 examples, it's a 0.5 because the text of the advertisement is very different, but then you can see the reuse of some of those words later on. Right. Where the use of such techniques currently stands in cybercrime research, I am not fully sure. I'd be happy to talk about these things with any of you further, of course. That's partly why I'm here. I want to pick your brains as well. Okay. So, in this slide, I wanted to share some information from a 2018 paper, our first to attempt to use machine learning and convolutional neural networks to examine patterns within the big data set of the images themselves from sales posts as obtained in that same 2017 era scrapes of public Instagram using, in this case, again, hashtag human skull for sale as one instance. We ran an experiment using TensorFlow version 2 and again, Google Inception version 3, reducing the multidimensional vector space using t-SNE and affinity propagation. So doing so, sorted the image corpus of hundreds of thousands of images into the clusters seen in the figure at left. Most clusters, once checked manually for commonalities, contain noise. For example, drawings of skulls, skulls on t-shirts, resin replicas, and the like. The 3 clusters highlighted with colored shapes, however, all contain posts of human remains for sale, positioned differently in the photograph. In one case, all with stated price tags written on the photos themselves using Adobe MS Paint or in emojis, tricks they use to get around algorithmic detection. So this experiment led to more recent work further probing how image composition and aesthetics has become a means for dealers and collectors to signal group belonging and, importantly, to say something is for sale without having to say it's for sale. So how readily such a method can apply to other areas of illicit trafficking or cybercrime research remains to be seen. But myself and Professor Graham have taken this approach on the human remains trade, and my colleagues in the Alliance to Counter Crime Online who study other areas of trafficking, wildlife to drugs, etc., are also trying to move more into the machine learning space to combine our efforts and to see where the patterns and the similarities lie between categories of trafficking, and what works for me might not work for them, and why, for example. Okay. So, my final case study turns our attention to the newest platform to become host to a variety of questionable or illicit content, TikTok. Not yet a sales platform, and currently only permitting short-form videos, it has created a new, very different means by which content creators can reach vast audiences in a public, personality-driven, very visual way. We are interested in examining what happened when the archaeological and osteological community of users was suddenly made more aware of the platform as a place where human remains traders can also advertise their businesses, show off collections, and steer interested purchasers elsewhere to other platforms or to websites. In this case, videos released by a certain individual last August, mentioned earlier in my talk, became the catalyst to use currently available scrapers. Here, Andrew Norden's TikTok scraper was available at the time, as well as Pixplot, again, and topic modeling, to deep dive into the networks of interaction and response that formed in the comment section and between accounts. So the visual left gives one example of what sorts of topics were discussed in videos and comments tagged with #BoneTalk. As direct pushback by the archaeological community in response to this person's videos going viral in the media. So bones is unsurprisingly the central theme of discussion in the corpus, but note the nodes formed around Tumblr and Bone Thief suggest that a previous instance of a grave robber being brought to task in part via social media in 2016 on Tumblr is part of the collective memory of many TikTok users who might follow this individual and have since mostly become critical of his ongoing selling under the veneer of education, in the face of the moral, ethical, and legal concerns that we as archaeologists constantly try to raise about the trafficking of antiquities and human remains. So work of this nature, I think, is rare but valuable, and it shows that a platform like TikTok that can offer pushback in a very different way than other platforms use much more for no questions asked selling, like Instagram, Facebook, or e-commerce platforms. Here we have a case where we can fight fire with fire a bit, and the networks that form in the vast ecosystem of users of this platform are only really approachable through these kind of methods. And we hope that these kind of methods can then be turned as a new way to look at the criminality side of this activity a bit more. So it's something that's really observed only so far on TikTok to our knowledge. We haven't seen it much elsewhere, but it's a tool we want to explore. Okay, so to wrap it up, it behooves me to briefly mention a few directions that colleagues and I, academic, law enforcement, and NGO alike, might go in the future. Partnerships will remain key, especially as we strongly suspect there is much more illicit trafficking out there than what we have found so far. I am also personally interested in figuring out what can be ethically discerned from payment and geolocation metadata behind what individual dealers may or may not share, which is, again, something else that I would like to talk to you as cybersecurity professionals more about, these kind of directions, because it's a gap in our data and a gap in our understanding. So assessing such information, as well as devising better ways to discern connections between networks that move different categories of trafficked goods would be useful to many, if it's possible to do so ethically and keep it all anonymous as well. So the longer it takes for platforms themselves to take these issues seriously, the more outreach to policymakers and the public and new research audiences will be required. Fundamentally, without demand, there is no supply. Okay. In this short summary talk, I hope you learned from me as much as I have been learning from you throughout this conference. If you want copies of any papers mentioned in my talk, or to read more about what the Alliance to Counter Crime Online or the Bone Trade Project itself are doing in more depth, please visit the websites listed here. I want to thank my funders or supporters. Whoops, there they are. The logo is behind me. And the cute little aliens there are learning their own lessons about market demand for the bone trade. But I want to end by thanking you all for your attention to this maybe obscure topic. And I hope that maybe this could open up some fruitful dialogue about how we can combine our efforts to bring your insights to the program of research that we've already started here and apply your knowledge to maybe something that would be new and exciting to you as well. So on that note, thank you very much, and bye.
Thank you, Damien. That was absolutely fascinating stuff, wasn't it? Wow, thank you. We do have a couple of questions online. I'll read out the first one. So your 2020 paper on this, you mentioned how selling of human remains is not illegal in all jurisdictions. When you were scraping Instagram for the human remains for sale, how did you determine if they came from an area where it was lawful as opposed to where it was not?
That's a good question. The collecting community has really kind of mythologized the idea that it's only illegal in the U.S. in Louisiana, Tennessee, and Georgia. And then they act that every other state and many other countries, they just assume carte blanche, everything is fine. In our research and in others, for example, Tanya Marsh in 2015, she's a law professor. She wrote The Law of Human Remains, even then pointing out that there are 37 U.S. states that have variations of laws on the books that would actually come into play and have something to say about the trade if they were enforced, let alone many other countries have versions of these laws around human remains as cultural property, sort of, or human remains as health issues, or human remains as an affront to the dignity of the dead. The laws kind of sit in these areas. It's a complicated mess. That's a question. When we do the scraping, oftentimes, at least on some platforms, they'll be clear about saying where they're posting and sending from, and if they want to send internationally or not. They'll repeat that no Louisiana, Tennessee, or Georgia line over and over, but beyond that, it seems like to their activities, the world's pretty open. But fundamentally, yes, we have to go from that, end point of this process, and we're using data from what they are presenting online. So behind that, they could be lying, of course, but we just have to go with what the data says, because that's the view that we have, and that's the view the tools give us as well. But it's a complicated legal situation for sure. Yes.
And there was another question online. What outcomes in seizing items or preventing illegal trades have you been able to achieve?
Yeah. A few. I've worked with a few law enforcement cases so far where they've had success in either at least holding the seized material for a while, if not getting it forfeited. Mostly, like I said in the slide, what we as civilians, either ACO or myself and the Bone Trade Project, we are more concerned with giving intel and context to our law enforcement colleagues in general. And that's why we've taken this big data approach to look at the big picture as much as possible. But we only get to work on cases if we get approached with cases. So we have always kind of been the players in the background that can help when asked. much like in digital forensics contests, we can see the forest for the trees, but we only get to look at certain trees if we're pointed to that certain tree. But then sometimes the archives we have can actually help them connect the dots between the seller, this was seized, the seller lied on their customs forms, we can prove that this was actually offered online these times on these dates, and that's actually sometimes been useful information to allow law enforcement to move more directly on some of these people. But it doesn't happen enough, and we hope in future it'll happen a lot more.
Excellent, thank you. Were there any other questions around the room? There's one from me though.
Yes.
Have you found any countries better or worse than others, sort of thing, in this type of, from like the law enforcement side, but then also from the trading side as well?
From the trading side, I think it's a Wild West kind of scenario. Everywhere is open. And even if a group or a seller or a forum or whatever will say, oh, we respect, we don't ship to this place because we respect the laws, it doesn't mean they won't for the right price. They could say one thing online, doesn't mean behind the scenes they're not bypassing it. For law enforcement, again, most countries try to police this to some extent, but it just varies so much. And it's like some, not to pick on anyone, but for example, Belgium, the Netherlands, I can think of two, trafficking of human remains, even the private market, is almost quite legal. It falls in, there's a big gap in the law, it's, whereas other countries try to restrict it a bit more, but that's a part of the problem that they face is because it happens so much online, that can kind of bypass jurisdictions. And there's not enough people on the ground to detect, shipments going through. So very few is actually caught and seized off, the market in transit that allows investigations to happen and these laws to actually be tested in courts. And that's partly also why we try and do what we do, because we can look at the online world as best as we can using these tools and others to give that context to say, okay, we can demonstrate a lot of people are collecting in America, England, various European countries, Australia. There are many demand countries. You guys know what the laws are currently in those countries. We want to show you that the laws aren't being applied enough because there's a lot more moving, and we can see evidence of that in the online chatter, if you will. The frequency of people saying, I got this shipment in the mail yesterday, came into me safely from the UK, came to me in Australia. That's right there another point saying, yep, that shipment, despite the laws, despite the differences, it made it through the post, it got overseas, it got to its buyer, and that's another checkpoint in their favor, if you will, to show that they can circumvent these laws. The laws need to catch up, but more importantly, the laws that are there just need to be enforced more. That's more the question, I think.
Yeah. Fantastic, thank you. Can we have a warm round of applause for Damien? Fascinating topic. And we have a few minutes until we get Mandy on, so hang around or come on in.